How did you feel at 18 about the fact that your father was having sex with you?
I hated it. I hated it. I hated it.
Hello, I am Solsticia. Today we are going to continue with astrological studies of murderers, and we were with the case of the Menendez family. Specifically, today we will look at and analyze the birth chart of Erik Menendez, and in the next videos we will have the birth chart of the father. The day of the event, the synastry between the two brothers, which is the video that follows, and continue with the story of this family that is disturbing. So I leave you with the birth chart of Erik Menendez. Birth chart of Erik Menendez. We have, according to the data found, that Erik was born on November 27, 1970 and 11:23 p.m. in New York, United States. He has the sun in the 4th house in Sagittarius, fire element. The moon is in the 3rd house in Scorpio, water element. And he has the ascendant in Virgo, earth element. As we can see, let's say that unlike his brother, Lyle had a little more elemental balance. This will probably benefit him throughout his life, to be able to look for ways out of the difficult things that we're now going to see in his natal chart. And we see that in quadrant 1 are Pluto, Uranus, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, the Moon, and Lilith. Well, what is this quadrant 1 telling us? The first quadrant is very full, because he is probably a very fearful person. He is very self-centered. He is learning to relate to the world. At that point, when everything is placed in quadrant 1, it gives a certain insecurity, those transpersonal planets there. Well, Erik was born in the year 70, so we were already changing decades. There were a lot of things going on. At the time Erik was born, let's say that Pluto and Neptune were in conversation in a sextile like a quiet thing. Uranus and Chiron are in opposition. In Erik's birth chart, we can see that this opposition is already perfected, and Uranus is already in Libra. It is already in another element, and Chiron is already in Aries. It is very curious what this Uranus-Chiron opposition produced in the year 70. Specifically, on February 1st, a train derailed in Argentina, leaving 236 people dead. There were many car accidents involving racing drivers who died in competition. Among them is McLaren, who died on June 2nd. We also have the Apollo 13 accident on April 11th. What happened? Well, this rocket took off for the moon, and when it was on the trajectory, an oxygen tank exploded, and they had to turn back. It was televised, and the whole world saw the accident, let's say. So that's why the Apollo 13 crash got so much attention that they made a movie about it starring Tom Hanks.
This is Houston. Say again, please?
Houston, we have a problem.
What else happened? There were also several earthquakes. On July 31st, there was one in Colombia measuring 8.0 on the Richter scale. Very serious. Then in August, there was another one in Panama. And then in December, there was one in Ecuador and Peru. There were also several very serious plane crashes during the year. On February 21st in Switzerland, on November 14th in the United States, and several suicides. Specifically, on September 18th, Jimi Hendrix died of an alcoholic coma. On October 7th, Janis Joplin dies of an overdose. And on November 25th, 2 days before Erik Menendez was born, Yukio Mishima commits harakiri. That is, he buries a sword in his stomach. Commits suicide so as not to be exposed to public scrutiny for his homosexuality. How did this Chiron-Uranus affect Erik? Well, he has it on the 8-2 axis. With that Chiron in the 8th house, the idea of death must have crossed her mind many times. But also that Chiron in the 8th house gives me a lot of faith because one can heal more deeply. What happens is that being in opposition to Uranus is a bit complicated because it is a difficult tension. Uranus is in Libra and Chiron is in Aries. What about this? That in itself is an internal conflict because they are two very opposite energies. Uranus is I want my freedom, I want to do what I want, and Chiron is I want to serve others. So, internally, natives with Uranus opposing Chiron may experience a struggle between their need for personal freedom and their ability to connect with the emotions of others. I also believe very much that this Uranus opposition, Chiron, must have produced a lot of fears for Erik. Very deep fears, fears of death. But also, that same fear of death made him perhaps investigate, be more curious about that side. So, how are we seeing the transpersonals in Erik's birth chart? Well, we are already seeing Uranus in the second house, Pluto in the second house. They are not in conjunction, and Pluto is in the last degree of Virgo, already about to leave in a beautiful sextile with Neptune. And here we have the complicated planet in this natal chart, and perhaps, although it is not necessarily the dominant planet, it is saying a lot in Erik's chart. So, let's start with that Neptune, and the analysis of Neptune in the 4th house, in Sagittarius. Well, a person who has Neptune in the 4th house, the 4th house represents the family, the home, the land, the homeland, and old age, the end of a person's life as well. So, Neptune in the 4th house gives that the parents never knew how to assume their parental responsibilities. It is closely related to alcoholism, drugs, parental aberrations, and so on. Neptune in the 4th house also gives a complicated childhood, because it is a person that everything that happened in his childhood was going to keep it as truth in the subconscious, to forget it somehow. So, probably if you ask Erik about episodes of his childhood, he will not even remember it. Also, we see that this Neptune is in conjunction with the Sun and also with the Moon. It is at the midpoint between the Sun and the Moon. What is this telling us? Well, Neptune conjunct Sun in the 4th house. What it is curiously telling us is the absence of the father figure. And Neptune conjunct Moon, and that Moon on the 3/4 axis, on the cusp of the 4th house. Very familiar, let's say, all that event in Erik's chart. Well, because that mother was really she was all the time alienated, out of it, like she wasn't there. Only that Neptune has a trine with Chiron in the 8th house, and Erik manages to fit in very well with the mother over time and manages to forgive her, because Erik has things in his chart that are much more compassionate than his brother, despite what happened. Internally, he needs that reconciliation to heal the mother in some way and to forgive. At the moment that everything happens, Erik is not capable with the mother, because the mother does fulfill a function. In his letter, she is present. Even if she is alienated, even if she is sick, he considers her to be a person who was ill, and that's it. So he does not have the idea or the dream of being loved by his mother. He accepts that things were like that, and that's it. But what they do have in their head, with that Neptune in the 4th house, Erik's big dream is to end his life by the sea. But let's now analyze Saturn and Jupiter in Erik's natal chart. If you can see, they are in opposition on the 3-9 axis. And look how supercharged Erik's 3rd house is. He has Venus, Jupiter, and the Moon there. The brother for him was love. The person who protected him, who took care of him. That house 3 so loaded with so many entities. They are all in Scorpio. Yes, Moon in Scorpio, Venus in Scorpio, and Jupiter in Scorpio. Very emotional, very passionate, very deep relationship with the brother. It is also full of very disturbing things, because after all, the ruler of Scorpio is Pluto. And we find Pluto in the 2nd house. And in the 2nd house, it's also telling us how important money was to Erik. Just like for the brother, although Erik is much more spiritual and flimsy even, that Pluto in the 2nd house and that Uranus in the 2nd house did give him very much the importance of money in his life and what they could become for money. Well, Erik has 3 entities in the 2nd house, which are Pluto, Uranus, and Mars. Pluto is in the last degree of Virgo, and Uranus is already in Libra. It is exactly 12 degrees Libra, but both are in the 2nd house. These 2 transpersonal planets are speaking there of the importance of money to him. Where one has a planet in a house, it is marking that that house is an especially important setting in one's life. And Pluto is a perverse one. Pluto has no forgiveness for anything. Well, neither does Uranus. So, that's partly where the waste and so forth and the interest comes from. But you know what really deep down those 2 transpersonal planets in the 2nd house give? They give a lot of fear. Fear of not having. That is why I believe that when everything happens, they dedicate themselves to squandering, because they probably had many restrictions on the part of their father. You can see that they were born in a cradle of gold. But the father was not so much of a facilitator of the standard of living that he had them living at, right, socially. As you can see, Jupiter and Saturn in Erik's natal chart are in opposition. That is a historical moment. In fact, it was the precedent for an economic breakdown in the early 70s. And that was the beginning that marked that historical moment as well. What did he give Erik? That of Jupiter and Saturn in opposition. Well, in principle, being incapable of having his own initiatives of structuring, it gave him to leave things unfinished in discipline. Well, this Jupiter is ruler of the Sun, and being in this tension with Saturn, it gives him inconstancy. It gives him to be a little superficial in life. It is a person who is not able to go deeper, to look at what are the lessons of life. It is that really one sees the astrological charts of the two, and there was something in which there was no limit. What would they go beyond that limit? That Jupiter and Saturn in opposition is also very depressing. With that Chiron in the 8th house, you have probably had a lot of death wishes at many times. Well, now let's move on to the personal planets. We see that he has the ascendant in Virgo. What does the ascendant in Virgo give Erik? Well, it gives him to be a perfectionist, meticulous, and so on. In addition, we see that his ruler Mercury is in the 4th house. He is probably very interested in the stories of the family, of the past, and so on. That Mercury also has a very good relationship. A semi-sextile with Jupiter and a sextile with Mars. That gives it a certain ability. That Jupiter in 3 also gives him a certain verbal ability, a certain facility with words. I believe that these two brothers can probably, now that they are talking about the review of their case, talk a lot about it, give conferences and lectures, because they both have the astrological charts to do so, to be able to transmit very well through words and make a good business with it.
Hey, are you paying attention to me? Well, the moment you've been waiting for has arrived. Subscribe, like, and if you have any opinion or question, leave it in the comment.
I really want to talk about that Venus in Scorpio, which is down there. Rather, self-esteem is a tricky thing with that Venus there, but it's also symbolizing to us the love of the sibling and the depth of the relationship with the sibling. That Venus has only 2 relevant aspects. One is a sextile with Lilith, which is curious because to me it is very actor-like. Also, Lyle has Lilith in quincuntium with Venus. That is to say, this is a very characteristic feature of actors. They both have that, it's coincident, and it's in semi-sextile with Uranus. I think that if Erik had been offered the chance to be a movie actor, he would have loved it. Now we go to Mars. It is at 24 degrees of Libra in the 2nd house. Mars is very good for getting money too, but also for spending it. So, it is also a bit of a wasteful trait, just like the Jupiter and Saturn in opposition in his chart. And that Mars in Libra, in addition, is very much related to sportsmen. But I believe that this boy was lacking in inconstancy, in discipline. I think he was always more lost for age in the nebula of that Neptune in the 4th house with his sun-moon, which I think even he must have experienced a lot of narcotic stuff in his body. Well, what else does this Mars give us? This Mars has several aspects. It has a very nice trine with the nodal axis, which in turn has a square, that nodal axis with Venus. There is something there about its forms of manifestation of libido, of masculinity, of love. I believe that this gave Erik to be a little more dispersed at the level of romances. Well, that Mars has a sesquiquadrature with Lilith, and now we are going to go to that Lilith. And it has a sextile with Mercury and a sextile with the Moon. So, because of this is yet another trait in which one says that Erik could have, despite the mother's pathologies, he could have communication with her. Because on the other hand, one thing I forgot to say before, Neptune and Chiron are in aspect, and Chiron is in the 8th house, and that gives psychism. So, he could contact the mother, even within his pathology. For me, the fact that Mars and Venus aspect the nodal axis, which is in its full descendant, practically on the cusp of the 7th house, is relational, and that Mars and Venus there is open sexually. It is open to many possibilities. And I want to emphasize again that in Erik's chart, we do not even find a biquintile, a sesquiquadrature, a minor aspect between Mars and Pluto. Neither do they have it. Erik does not have that trait. Well, as I come back and repeat, the 3rd house is tremendously populated by Jupiter, by Venus, and by the Moon. The brother has an important relevance. The brother was his luck. The brother was that Jupiter and Mercury. Mercury is in the 4th house also, and has communication with that Jupiter in the 3rd house. They have a semi-sextile, and so that is nice because maybe in that intimate world he could talk a lot with his brother. It was perhaps the only line through which he could unload all the imbalance he had, because now we are going to see where they are. In what way those imbalances were manifested, or rather produced, in Erik's birth chart. In this Moon, in the 3rd house, in Scorpio. Well, as we can see in Erik's chart, the Moon and Mercury are out of bounds. What does it mean that the planets are out of bounds? Well, it's a measurement, not on the ecliptic, but on the declination on the axis of the equator. So what happens when a person has planets out of bounds? These planets are out of control. It's like they have no restraint at all. Having an out-of-bounds moon is a person who has no emotional control, who is going to act a little bit like because they feel like it impulsively and without any kind of control. It is also talking about the lack of affective and maternal containment that a person should have. And a Mercury out of bounds, because a little bit of what happened is the uncontrolled verbalism. What he speaks does not think, does not go through any kind of filter. He simply throws it out, releases the words, and says what he does not have to say. Why the moon in conjunction with Neptune? Because that moon, if you look at it, and then when you do the synastry, that is, the relationship between the two brothers, you will see that they have opposite moons. Lyle has the moon in Taurus and Erik has the moon in Scorpio, and they are opposite by very few degrees. It's pretty even, that opposition. And if we remember that Lyle had Lyle conjunct his moon, well, Algol, the evil star, that is, Erik has Algol in opposition to that natal moon. There we go again, talking about that difficult childhood figure, the mother figure, and so on. In case you have not seen the video of the brother, Algol is an evil star that is in the constellation of Perseus, which has been observed for thousands of years. It was already encrypted since the Babylonians as a star that brought misfortune. And of course, located in relation to the moon will always be someone's childhood. It will always be his emotional world disturbed and somehow already makes him a bit tormented. Unlike Lyle, who had a relationship of all the planets and makes him a more complex person, in Erik we do not. In Erik we see few traits and almost more of a very overwhelmed person who was annulled. Well, just like in Lyle's chart, we see that in Erik's chart, Pluto and Mars, which are the planets that are supposed to talk to us about sexuality, about abuse, about being overwhelmed in life, well, we still see that they are not related. So I remembered back in my old studies that Poseidon went overboard with Medusa. Who was Medusa really? Medusa was a beautiful priestess of the temple of Athena, the most consecrated woman, and it was rumored everywhere that she was very beautiful. But she was devoted to her consecration with Athena. The thing is that Poseidon, Neptune, had lost a battle, a war with Athena for the city of Athens, and was very angry with her. So he decided to take revenge. And what did he do to take revenge? Well, he overtook Medusa directly in the temple itself. Athena, when she found out dead with rage, instead of condemning Neptune, directly punished Medusa, put snakes on her head, and made anyone who looked at her turn her into stone and turned her into a really frightful being, identical to her sisters, the Gorgons, and sent them to live with them. What is clear is that Medusa is a mythological symbol of victimization. So, what's going on? That Medusa is an asteroid that's between the core between Mars and Jupiter. There's a lot of asteroids that are there. There's Ceres, Pallas. Keep in mind that there are asteroids that are bigger than Pluto, and these asteroids affect us, and mythologically they are contemplated. So, Medusa is conjunct. This asteroid is asteroid 149, and we went to look for it, and it turns out that Poseidon, Neptune, in Erik's natal chart, is in conjunction to Medusa, to this asteroid. That's the significance of the fact that the father did go over with him. Especially in Erik's chart, it is very visible, because let's remember that Neptune is also in conjunction with the sun, with the moon in opposition to Algol. Yes, bad things happen there. Also, that Neptune, many times in the 4th house, is telling of hidden spaces inside the house where things happened that it is better to forget. And I think that this is very marked there with the discovery of this conjunction of Neptune-Medusa, which for me would give an explanation, because if not, then it is difficult for me to understand if Mars and Pluto had no relationship. How could it be that the father overstepped his bounds? Well, because Neptune and Medusa, at least in Erik's chart, is fixed. Well, and now finally add Lilith in the ascendant. Lilith, as in Lyle's chart, is also in Erik's ascendant, only that Erik has it a little more damaged. He has it in a square to the sun, and that is already telling us that there was a very bad relationship with the father, very unpleasant. While in Lyle, one can see that he identifies in some way with the father and has more resources to hold on to and be able to build a life, Erik has none, but that Lilith in the ascendant gave him precisely to rebel against that son, against that father who appeared as absent. But when he appeared and did, by the interpretation that one can have of these planetary events. Lilith in the 1st house and in the ascendant gives charisma, and this in the two brothers is very significant. In Erik, victim or executioner? No, Erik is directly a victim, but a total and absolute one. My God, one sees that fourth house with that Neptune, that Sun, that Moon in opposition to Algol, with Medusa there. Oh no, poor thing. This one was indeed a victim, and a victim familiar to all. And I think the most curious thing is that he is the only one who is able to forgive. I think the father did overdo it very badly with him. He directly left him with a trauma in which Erik prefers, I think, to forget his whole childhood. And it gave him a huge emotional imbalance, an internal thing, a world where he had nowhere to hold on to. It is that Erik has no tools in his natal chart, maybe that Mars that was in a sextile with the Moon, and gave him a sporting possibility, and that's where he could have gone. With Erik's Neptune, I would look a lot more for art, and please like and subscribe to keep this going. In the next video, synastry and compatibility of the two brothers.
Well, that's all for today. A big hug says goodbye to all of you, and until our next video. A big hug.